Denver, Colorado, 2004, 5:17 a.m. Winter still held the city in a tight grip, even so close to spring. The sky was the color of dull steel, and a chilly breeze drifted through the quiet streets of a simple neighborhood, where the sidewalks reflected the faint glow of streetlights that had not yet turned off. The air smelled of damp wood and freshly brewed coffee from a nearby house. A thin layer of snow accumulated overnight glittered like glass dust scattered across the ground. At that exact moment, as the city slowly awoke, a small and symbolic event began, what would become a story impossible to ignore. The wind lifted a forgotten newspaper from the sidewalk and made it briefly hover in the air before it landed against the feet of a man who was serenely watching the horizon. Emiliano Reyes, a 32-year-old Mexican immigrant, newly arrived in the United States and already accustomed to the weight of gazes that never said everything but implied too much. He bent down, picked up the newspaper, and folded it carefully, as if each gesture needed to carry dignity. He wore the same worn brown coat as always, with hand-reinforced seams. His face, marked by the cold and a hard life, held a calm and disciplined expression. His eyes, however, carried a silent depth, as if they always saw further than anyone imagined. Emiliano's strong accent was a source of amusement among the residents. On that street, he only had to open his mouth for someone to twist their face, pretend not to understand, or comment on how hard it is to talk to someone who doesn't speak properly. Some neighbors treated him well out of politeness, others poorly out of habit. There were those who considered him kind, but incapable, educated yet limited, hard-working but destined to never achieve anything beyond what was allowed. And yet, on that dawn, he awoke like all the others in silence, observing the world, holding within himself something no one there suspected. The first part of his routine was always the same. He walked to a specific spot in the neighborhood, an old streetlight, leaning to the right, with rust marks, where he put on headphones bought at a used goods store and repeated English words. Simple words, always the same ones. As if he were training not just the language, but a kind of inner resilience. The community viewed it with strangeness. There he is again, they would murmur, talking to himself as if he were giving a lecture to a tree. Teenagers laughed. Adults watched with cordial disdain. Some simply ignored him. But Emiliano never reacted. He continued, every day without fail, as if the repetition were part of a secret ritual that demanded devotion. When he finished the exercise, he walked to the warehouse where he worked as a cleaning assistant. His job was to sweep enormous sheds, organize boxes, clean bathrooms, lift heavy bags of trash. Almost no one talked to him. And when they did, they spoke too slowly, over-articulating, as if they were talking to someone who would never understand any complex sentence. You clean here, okay? Here, one of the supervisors would say, pointing to the floor. Yes, sir. Emiliano would respond gently, even though he understood more than they pretended to believe. His colleagues would comment from a distance. He's hard-working, but that accent will hold him back in life. There's no point in studying, some people just aren't cut out for it. He listened to everything. He swallowed it all and turned it all into silent fuel. At the end of each shift, he would walk to the small neighborhood public library. There he always sat at the same table, near the American politics section, where he consulted old books, speeches by historical figures, parliamentary transcripts, biographies of leaders, and rhetoric manuals. Some regulars looked strangely at that simple Latino man, reading such dense materials. He probably doesn't even understand half of it. He must think he's important. But the pages for Emiliano were not just study. They were pathways. They were invisible architectures of a future no one else could see. At night, in the tiny room he rented behind an Ecuadorian family's house, he wrote in a blue-covered notebook. Not long texts, but small phrases, loose ideas, excerpts from speeches, reflections on identity and diaspora. On one of the pages he wrote, "If they ever listen to me, it will be because they could no longer ignore me." Then he carefully closed the notebook, storing it in a metal box under the bed. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and the routine remained unchanged, built on silence, discipline, and patience. Emiliano rarely responded to provocations, and when he did, he replied with a shy smile. This further irritated some residents, who confused his calm with submission, his kindness with weakness, his politeness with limitation. What no one saw, because no one wanted to see, was how each dawn shaped something essential within him, how each page read expanded his vision, how each word repeated before the rusty lamppost refined not only his English, but his courage. He was training something he couldn't even name, but felt deeply, a voice that was being born. One day, while sweeping the warehouse, he found a crumpled paper on the floor. It was a flyer announcing a local speech contest for immigrants, promoted by the city's community center. Free theme, free entry, small event, but upon touching the paper, Emiliano felt something different, as if it were a calling, not a ready-made destiny, but a stepping stone. He didn't tell anyone. He put the flyer in his pocket, took a deep breath, and continued sweeping. For weeks he began to discreetly rehearse, in the backyard, in the work bathroom, on the way between the library and his home. His speeches were short, but dense. They spoke of belonging, of dignity, of how language shapes identity, but never erases roots. Most people who observed him practicing said, "He must be trying to memorize phrases for a job interview. Maybe he's practicing to ask for a promotion. It's no use, that accent will never fade." And so time advanced, through the ice, through the dust, through the silences, until one day, he received an unexpected call from the community center. A withdrawal had opened a spot for a last participant. He had been selected. The neighbors laughed. Colleagues doubted. His supervisor scoffed, saying he could barely say his own last name in English. But for the first time in years, Emiliano felt that his voice, though imperfect, though strange to others' ears, was about to touch something greater than himself. And in that instant, even though no one noticed, his story truly began. The community center hall seemed larger than it actually was. The walls were covered in beige paint, stained by time, and the wooden floor creaked under the weight of the metal chairs that volunteers dragged from one side to another. The smell of overbrewed coffee mingled with the odor of old books stored on shelves near the stage. Everything in that place seemed to carry a story, but none as silent as the one Emiliano carried within himself. The dress rehearsals took place 3 days before the event. He arrived early, as he always did, holding a carefully folded notepad. He wore a simple shirt, cotton pants, worn shoes. Some participants greeted him with timid nods. Others ignored him completely, believing he had only signed up by mistake. When he went up on stage to test the microphone, the organizers exchanged curious glances. It wasn't explicit disdain, but the automatic assumption that he would struggle. And indeed, his first sentences sounded shaky. His English was heavily accented, syllables stretched too long, certain words came out harsh, with echoes of Spanish phonetics. A volunteer made a note on her clipboard, as if registering an inevitable error. Another organizer adjusted the microphone lower, thinking it would help soften the accent. Emiliano didn't react. The pause he made between one sentence and another wasn't out of insecurity, it was out of calculation. He was studying the sound of his own voice in that environment, the echo, the vibration, the reach. He observed how his timbre filled the space, how people reacted, where they averted their gaze. When he stepped off the stage, he heard whispers, "The speech actually has content, but it'll be hard to understand. I hope he doesn't make a fool of himself." There was no direct malice, just the automatic conviction that he would never achieve anything requiring eloquence. That night, upon arriving home, he opened his blue notebook and wrote just one sentence: "The voice they expect to hear is not the voice I will deliver." In the following days, he worked tirelessly. He practiced breathing in the empty corridors of the warehouse. He rehearsed facial expressions in front of the cracked bathroom mirror. On the way to the library, he mentally repeated the most difficult sentences, adjusting pauses, rearranging words, trying to extract the purest possible emotion from each segment. He wasn't trying to hide his accent. He was trying to transform it into presence. The day of the event arrived with cloudy skies, a cold wind, and a particular silence that enveloped the entire neighborhood. People walked towards the community center, more out of curiosity than support. Many wanted to see the Mexican with the muddled English try his luck on stage. Some wore heavy coats, others took discreet photos of the building to post online later, commenting something ironic. The hall was packed. The audience murmured, chuckled softly, adjusted coats, crossed their arms impatiently. Children ran between the rows. A Mexican woman smiled at Emiliano when she saw him enter, as if recognizing a similar journey in another immigrant. He sat in the third row, motionless, holding the paper with his speech folded 3 times. He wasn't trembling, he wasn't sweating. He seemed made of stone, but with a heart ablaze. One by one, the participants were called. Well-articulated speeches, firm voices, impeccable English. Some drew enthusiastic applause, others just polite claps, but none of them seemed to carry anything beyond what was expected: technique, clarity, competence. When his name was announced, there was a very brief silence, the kind not given out of respect, but out of surprise. Emiliano slowly stood up, walked to the stage, and positioned himself in front of the microphone. The glare of the lights made his eyes water for a second, but he didn't look away. His hands were loose at his sides, and his posture, though simple, possessed something undeniably dignified. He took a deep breath. The hall seemed to hold its breath with him. When he began to speak, his voice indeed carried the accent everyone expected, strong, evident, distinctive. But there was something different in that intonation, an unexpected firmness, a cadence that seemed to dance between fragility and grandeur, an emotional rhythm that captivated the audience silently. Gradually, he wasn't trying to sound American, he was trying to sound true. He spoke of the feeling of searching for words that seemed to flee, of the discomfort of opening his mouth, knowing someone would laugh before even listening, of the loneliness that grew when his voice was treated as noise. And at the same time, he spoke of resistance, of identity building, of how a person can shape their story, even when the world around insists on underestimating them. As he progressed, his posture transformed. His sentences gained strength. His pauses became more precise. His eyes shone with such deep conviction that even those who were rooting against him felt a shiver down their spine. For a few moments, no one noticed the accent anymore. They only noticed the man before them. At the end of the speech, Emiliano said, "I learned that a voice doesn't have to sound perfect to achieve a perfect destiny." For 3 long seconds, silence returned, then a timid applause, another, a few more, and in the end, a sincere chorus of clapping hands, not out of pity, not out of politeness, but out of unexpected recognition. He descended from the stage without smiling, but with illuminated eyes. The feeling was not one of victory, but of confirmation. He had finally found the right way to exist in that language. The next day, while sweeping the warehouse, he received an unexpected message. The university professor, who had attended the event, had sent an email praising his courage, his authenticity, and the way he had transformed his accent into emotional expression. He suggested that Emiliano participate in a local political training program for immigrants, and offered help with applications, forms and letters of recommendation. Some colleagues heard the news and commented, "In that kind of program, must be some diversity initiative to fill a quota. He won't last." But with each new stage, Emiliano remained steadfast. He studied in the early hours of the morning. He honed his writing. He practiced his argumentation. He observed public debates with almost surgical attention. In time he became one of the program's most dedicated participants. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. The accent was still there, strong, unmistakable, but now it served as a hallmark, not a barrier. Months turned into years, and one day, As he walked to work with his headphones at maximum volume, listening to historical speeches that always inspired him, his cell phone vibrated. An unknown number, a formal voice, a short direct message, impossible to predict. Mr. Reyes, we would like to invite you to represent our community at a special hearing in the U.S. Congress. He stopped in the middle of the street. The cold wind hit his face, lifting the collar of his coat. The city continued to move around him, but in that instant, the world seemed suspended. His whole life they had told him his accent would prevent him from achieving anything. Now, they wanted him to bring that exact voice to the place that defines the future of millions. Emiliano took a deep breath. He closed his eyes and simply said, "Yes, I will be there." And so began the deepest and most challenging stage of his journey. The days leading up to the trip to Washington, D.C., seemed to come from another life. Emiliano woke up early as always, repeated words in front of the rusty lamppost, but now not out of insecurity, but out of respect for the ritual that had shaped his voice. People in the neighborhood, previously accustomed to ignoring him, stopped to observe him. Some looked with suspicion, others with surprise, a few with timid pride. The news that he would speak before influential politicians spread through the neighborhood like an impossible-to-confirm rumor. They really called him. Maybe it's just to fill a quota. I can't imagine him speaking in a place like that. Meanwhile, while others tried to fit the new development into their limited narratives, Emiliano remained true to himself, disciplined, silent, observant. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He was merely seeking to honor the path he had built, stone by stone, word by word. He received formal preparation, briefings, documents, quick meetings with local representatives, text adjustments. He read everything carefully, called the professor who had encouraged him, revising each sentence as if he were polishing a unique gem. Some advisors offered suggestions to lessen his accent, but he refused them all. "If I speak as myself," he said calmly, and no one dared to insist. The journey took place on a clear morning. He had never been on a plane before. He sat by the window, gripping the armrests tightly during takeoff, as the city grew small beneath his feet. He watched the clouds pass like living mountains, and for a few moments, he felt something he hadn't felt in many years, a sense of belonging to his own destiny. When he arrived in Washington, everything seemed too grand, too organized, too formal. The monumental architecture of the federal buildings left him speechless. The cold Capitol wind bit at his cheeks, but he walked steadily. With each step, he remembered the voices that laughed, the comments that tried to diminish him, the long nights studying under a yellow lamp, the solitude that had accompanied him for so many years. On the morning of the hearing, he put on his only suit, dark blue, rented, and carefully styled his hair. Looking at himself in the mirror, he saw not just himself, but everything he had carried with him to that point. His parents, his grandparents, his childhood in rural Mexico, his exhausting jobs in the United States, his notebooks, his old headphones, his stumbles, his silences. He didn't just represent his own voice, he represented many others that had never been heard. Congress was in special session when he entered. The hall was immense, with tall columns, polished wood, and impeccably aligned flags. People walked with documents in hand, conversing in serious, resolute tones. Aides typed without pause. Everything seemed too fast, too complex, too unattainable for someone who, years before, had swept warehouses and collected trash in cardboard boxes. An official led him down the central aisle. Emiliano kept his gaze forward. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. When his name was announced, some members exchanged glances, as if trying to recall who he was. Others flipped through papers to check the guest's profile. Some perhaps expected an academic, a famous activist, a renowned professional. Few imagined that the man ascending the podium, with slow steps and quiet determination, was someone who spoke English with such a noticeable accent. He positioned himself before the microphone. The hall fell into absolute silence. There were no old curtains. There was no laughter. There were no whispers. It was him and his voice. He took a deep breath. His hands were steady, his memories vivid. And then he began, "Good morning," and his accent immediately emerged, strong, clear, impossible to ignore. Someone tilted their head slightly, as if puzzled. Another aide pressed their lips together, anticipating difficulty. But Emiliano didn't hesitate. He spoke about immigration without cold numbers. He spoke about identity without prepared speeches. He spoke about dignity without asking for pity. He spoke about work, about resilience, about the silent courage of those who cross borders, carrying not just bags, but dreams that the world insists on calling an exaggeration. He described the early mornings of study. He described the feeling of being repeatedly misunderstood. He described the automatic judgments, triggered with every syllable. He described what it's like to live in a land where your voice is treated as if it weren't your own. And comma little by little, the hall began to change. At first some only listened out of obligation.
Yes!
Then they listened out of respect. Then because they couldn't help themselves. During a brief pause, Emiliano looked around and saw something he never would have imagined. People leaning forward, trying not to miss a single word. No one laughed. No one mocked. No one scorned his pronunciation. His accent, once a source of laughter, now seemed to carry the exact weight of the story he was telling, as if it were a signature, not a flaw. At the end of his speech, he said, "If my voice sounds different, it's because it was born in two worlds, and perhaps that's precisely why it deserves to be heard here." The silence that followed was not one of discomfort, it was one of impact. And then came the twist, the one that would change not only his trajectory, but the meaning of everything he had heard throughout his life. When he finished, an important member of the committee, someone known for being rigid, unreceptive to emotional speeches, stood up and said, "Mr. Reyes, your testimony will be officially recommended for the National Program on Immigrant Integration. Your speech, it changes things." The entire hall reacted. Some gave a standing ovation. Others nodded slowly, as if something inside them had been dismantled and rebuilt in the same instant. Aides who had previously looked at him with suspicion now approached to congratulate him. People asked for copies of the speech. Journalists took photos. Representatives from civil workers and nations sought his contact. The accent, they said, was his prison, had just become his bridge. When he returned home, already at night, he found neighbors waiting on the sidewalk. There was no irony. There was no scorn. There was embarrassment, admiration, surprise. A girl hugged him. A man shook his hand firmly. A lady who had never spoken to him beyond a good morning said, "You spoke for all of us." In the following days, his story spread. Schools invited him to speak. Local newspapers ran stories.
Yeah.
Immigrants of various nationalities sent letters thanking him for having spoken what they never had the courage to say. Years later, his speech continued to be cited in educational programs and linguistic integration projects. His text was included in compilations of historical testimonies. His name became a reference, not for having erased his accent, but for having transformed his own voice into an instrument of change. Children who saw him ridiculed grew up saying they would learn English with courage, like Mr. Emiliano. Teachers reproduced excerpts of his speech in the classroom. The rusty pole where he trained during so many early mornings received a small commemorative plaque, placed anonymously. His legacy crossed generations, not for grandeur but for authenticity, not for perfection, but for truth. And whenever someone said that accents are obstacles, someone replied, "Then you don't know Emiliano Reyes. Whatever your origin, your tone of voice, your way of speaking, the world will try to convince you that certain doors are not for you. But doors don't recognize accents. Doors open when someone decides to walk through them, even if others insist it will be impossible." Emiliano's story is not about overcoming judgments. It's about continuing to walk despite them. It's about building something so profound that at the right moment,
No one can ignore it, and perhaps it's about you too.